Hi, everybody. This is Adam Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology. It's Monday, December 17th, and I'm sitting down today to make the third part of a three-part series that I'm doing on the change of the nodes of the moon into Cancer and Capricorn. I've said this just about in every video, I think, but I'm doing this series because I get the most questions about eclipses and usually about the nodes of the moon. Maybe it's at the top of the list with a few other things, but generally speaking, the subject of the nodes of the moon and eclipses are, something that I feel like I end up fielding, especially around eclipse season every year, more than anything else. So I decided to do a little bit more of an extended series on the nodes of the moon, and in particular, looking at Cancer and Capricorn, and even more specifically, because Cancer and Capricorn are the signs of the moon and Saturn, I've been looking at those two planets and how to understand eclipses happening relative to the deep nature of those planets. So in the first two talks, I talked a lot about the nodes of the moon in general, and I also talked about the traditional take and the kind of East versus West take on the nodes, and tried to put some of make some comparisons between modern use and understanding of the nodes, say in a more evolutionary approach and perhaps a more traditional approach. I think they have a lot in common, but I think there are also some big differences. So I've tried to highlight some of those in this series. Last talk, I also went into Saturn at length and talked about Saturn and Capricorn and try to sort of dispel some of the common, I think, misconceptions about Saturn and about Capricorn. So if you haven't seen the first two parts of this series, you may want to check those out. They're on my YouTube channel. One of the things that I mentioned about the nodes of the moon in the last talk, that actually I got quite a few responses. I got quite a few kind of responses from people who seemed a little troubled by something that I said. So I want to take a moment to talk about that. One of the things that I said, which was a little controversial in my last talk, was that we think too much about the nodes of the moon and the North Node in particular in relation to the idea of purpose. So I kind of, one of the things that I will often do, which is just sort of rhetorical, is to sort of caricaturize something. In order to draw something out, I'll make a caricature of something that maybe is a stereotype in modern astrology, and then I'll kind of go after it. So admittedly, that's not entirely fair, because a lot of the times modern astrologers are really quite subtle and I think quite brilliant. And so sometimes in characterizing certain elements of modern astrology, I may sort of be setting up a straw man in a sense. But there are, being around, in the astrological world for going on 10 years now, and seeing a lot of what circulates on social media from not necessarily from the cream of the crop of modern astrology, I'm trying to address something of what I see as the most general problems surrounding the popular use of the nodes of the moon in modern astrology. So just to say that, so that it's clear that I'm not trying to rip on the nodes too intensely. I think I mentioned this in both lectures, that I have good friends of mine who are, practice evolutionary astrology. And but I do think debate and, substantive debate about these topics is also a good thing. So let me just say this for starters, that what I was saying last time about the nodes of the moon in general is that I'm very skeptical of the idea that the North Node represents one's sense of purpose in life and the South Node represents something from the past that maybe you're trying to get over. Or, as again, I've quoted each time, famous astrologer once said that the South Node of the moon is like the bottle and the North Node of the moon is like the meeting. And I have a real problem with this particular characterization of the nodes, because I don't believe it's in keeping with the traditional way the nodes were understood. And I believe the way that the nodes were understood traditionally is more nuanced and personally just more interesting to me. So the way that the nodes were traditionally conceptualized, as I've said in each of these, and they're related to eclipses, that this is what we're studying in terms of the changing of the nodes into Cancer and Capricorn, is that the nodes of the moon are connected to the moon, and the moon represents fortune, the turning wheel of material circumstances, the way that things go up and things go down, whether it's material qualities as simple as the qualities of, the temperature or the circulation of fluids in the body, or the rise and fall of fortune or of empires. We're just talking about the churning of the wheel of fortune. That's the lunar realm. And the north node of the moon, or the ascending node, was generally associated with increase in the realm of fortune. And the descending node was associated with decrease. It could be increase for good or bad, and it could be decrease for good or bad. And so when we look at the tradition and we say, again, what did Indian astrologers say about that increase and decrease? They were rather skeptical about increase and felt that more often than not, increase in the world keeps people from spiritual life, because the more things that we have and the more things that we gain, in a sense, the easier it is to turn away from spiritual consciousness or the divine, however you want to think about that. Whereas when we lose things, when there's pain and when there's suffering, or decrease, which is associated with the south node, was considered to be a little bit more auspicious, because it was thought to remind us that we are living in an impermanent body and there's impermanence all around us, and that helps us stay home in the heart and stay connected to our spiritual source. So that's the take that I've been trying to explain on the nodes, sort of advocate for that and say, and the piece about purpose for me is like this. Again, when you look at the majority of the way that the world lives, right? Purpose is kind of a luxury. For a lot of people, the idea of purpose that we carry in the West anyway, right now at this point in history, right, is, it's real heroic. And it often carries with it a sense of like, I was born to do something special, to become something, to, so self-help and growth and achieving something and a special destiny and all this. In some ways, we wish that everyone in the world could be afforded the opportunity to have such a luxury, to pursue some sense of individual calling or purpose. And I'm not against those things, just to be clear. My point is that most of us, we also live in a world where purpose is a kind of luxury. There was an article I was reading the other day that I quoted that said, 1/10 of the world is just specifically is below the poverty line, like serious poverty, and living in Asia. And like just to really get a picture of what the actual story is for a lot of people, that, in this article, it was just saying like, one out of 10 people in the world is specifically in one specific part of the world and really struggling for just basic survival. And there's not, and those of us who have the luxury of thinking a lot about what's my purpose, what's my calling, what am I here for? There's nothing wrong with that, but it's also just recognizing that for a lot of people, purpose is an afterthought compared to the sort of grueling reality of everyday life. And astrology has to be able to depict reality as it is, not just as it exists from, within an ivory tower of privilege. And so the nodes of the moon, when we tuck them into a Western narrative about personal progress and personal spiritual growth and all of that stuff, sometimes, again, it gets really out of touch with the way that things actually are. A lot of our lives, again, are spent doing really mundane things: sleeping, eating, taking care of bills and kids, and dealing with bad backs. And I believe that we run the risk of missing out on what makes things sacred, which often is not a narrative about purpose that's really heroic, but rather it's about how to change the quality of our consciousness within the mundane things that we do that really aren't that heroic and filled with great purpose or, milestones of achievement on some kind of evolutionary ladder. Now, to be clear, I don't think that all evolutionary astrologers, I'm making a kind of caricature of what I see as a kind of potential for narcissism in astrology that sometimes I see connected to the North Node and the sense of progress, and I'm here to get something right, and I didn't do it right last time. And I don't see that kind of story actually reflected in the history of Buddhism. I don't see that story reflected in the history of yoga. I don't, when we look at the sacred scriptures of many traditions who have talked about past lives, that's certainly not the picture that's presented in terms of how and why souls find themselves struggling in the material reality from body to body and lifetime to lifetime. So if we're going to borrow that paradigm, then I think at least we should take a look at what was really said. One of the most common things that's really said in many traditions that embrace past lives and karma is that there's been too many lives for your past lives. There's been too many past lives for your past lives to really matter, to pay too much attention to. These are things, again, that I have friends who do past life regressions. I have done past life regressions myself. I've had past life experiences in ayahuasca ceremonies. I'm not trying to devalue the idea of past lives either. I'm just simply saying that traditionally the nodes of the moon were not really associated with trying to read into past lives too much. And they weren't necessarily related to the idea that there's some kind of homework assignment that you have in this life either. And sometimes I think those ideas become a little heroic and grandiose. So that's the point I'm trying to make. And people can, feel free to disagree, obviously. I don't mean to make that claim in a really dogmatic way, but I get the questions. Believe me when I say that it's frustrating when, I take a position like I do philosophically as I'm explaining right now, and to get something like, 100 letters a year from people who assume that there is absolutely no other way of looking at the nodes of the moon than what I'm talking about right now, right? So that's my simplest point, I guess. I wanted to say that to clarify because I got so many questions about people being like, so you don't believe we have purpose? No, of course we have purpose. But for me, again, like I find that if purpose, I feel that the most important purpose is to find our way into love and in the heart. And I feel like that purpose often has more to do with how we show up in the events in life and not what the events of life are. How we show up in the things that are limiting and difficult and mundane. How do I show up in doing the small things? To me, those are usually the places where love and enlightenment of some kind can really blossom and surprise us. And it's not usually in the big heroic things. Most of us live, I think, compared to the moments where we're really in our heart and really loving, I find that we could be doing the most heroic thing in the world and it ends up being rather empty. So that's where I'm coming from when I say all of that. Now, tonight, what we're going to talk about, continuing on with the nodes of the moon, is, again, just the basic idea that these nodes of the moon in Cancer and Capricorn, my number one thing that I wanted to advocate for this was don't believe the hype when you hear people, just railing on how bad the South Node is in Capricorn and how we're all supposed to be headed towards a real cushy family get-together in Cancer. There's more to it than that, right? Again, think of Cancer right now, the sign of Cancer, as related to general increase and general sense of what's flourishing, but also where our desires lie. And that could be very complicated and not necessarily very good, or it could be healthy. Similarly, the South Node of the moon is related to where we might be seeing decrease, letting go, difficulties, and hardships or decline. But that decline doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. As I mentioned, I went on a number of long explanations in the last video about Saturn and the darkening or blackening of Saturn, and the actually really very deep relationship that Saturn has to Neptunian qualities, and the way that Saturn, prior to Neptune's discovery, was really held the place for a lot of Neptunian qualities. So I talked about that in the last lecture. Check that out if you want more on Capricorn and the South Node. But today we're going to talk about the North Node and Cancer and what it is specifically that calls to us in the sign of the moon, and hopefully get rid of just the very simple domestic stereotypes of Cancer as well. As of Cancer myself, I'm not going to lie that there's a lot of things about me that are sort of totally stereotypically Cancer. Like, I'm a family guy, I like being a dad, there's stuff like that. But there's a lot of elements about Cancer that I have gotten to know because I'm sun sign Cancer, Mercury Cancer, and I feel like they're not really well represented in the astrological world. Again, just generally speaking, I'm not talking about some of my favorite astrologers out there who do a really nice job with them. Just, kind of in general, I just don't see a lot of really insightful, interesting things written about Cancer or the moon, what to speak of Saturn as well. So, especially when you put them in relationship to one another, because, if all you end up getting is like, okay, so Cancer is the patriarchy and the moon is the matriarchy, or just ridiculous, like reductionist statements like this. So hopefully we're going to diversify our understanding of the moon tonight. But let's start by just saying, issuing a few reminders that are really interesting to think about. Remember that the moon in Cancer, it's calling to us in the next year and a half with eclipses in that sign. It's compelling. It's drawing us into things. Could be very tempting and complicating, not necessarily a good thing, or it could be something that's genuinely expansive and sort of, where things are sort of growing or blossoming. That's the nature of the North Node in general. So when we look at Cancer, we're looking at the sign tropical sign of the summer solstice in the first 30 days roughly after the summer solstice. So that's a time of year where, even though you've basically reached summer, the light is starting to decline or come down the slope of the solar year, and the light is starting to decrease day by day, even though it's the summer. So I talked about this before in a video on the sign of Cancer, but this is the sign of the moon specifically because the moon is related to the world of materiality that the spirit is thought to descend into. So the descent of spirit into matter is represented by Cancer because the light is starting to descend from the high point. And the moon, of course, is the ruler of the realm of materiality, the realm of changes. I've said this so many times. The moon, because it is a reflective light and not an original light, is thought to represent something of the material world in the Platonic sense, where in this material world sometimes it's described, for example, as if you were to look in a pond on a sunny day and you see a tree in the reflected in the water, you not having seen a tree before, like perhaps the prisoners in Plato's cave, the allegory of the cave, you might think that reflection is all that is real. You might say, wow, look at that beautiful tree in the water, and think that it's real. Of course, turning around and seeing the real tree, you'd go, oh, that was just a reflection. Well, similarly, Plato was on about this idea of the material world being a reflection of something that's immaterial, or something that is more intangible. It's not in a sense a part of these constant movements and changes, which are like reflections on the water. Well, that's why the moon is said to represent the realm of fortune, because the moon is a reflective light that shines with the image of something original, or the spirit. But itself, the moon itself has no light of its own. So similarly, matter, just dead matter without the animating life of consciousness and spirit, is just stuff. It's just kind of dead. So it's this relationship between the two, however, is sacred and very interesting. And that's really what the moon is all about. To understand the moon, you have to understand the sort of darkness of the moon, the kind of cold hardness of the moon. as well as the mirror-like quality of the moon that becomes illuminated by the light of spirit and becomes a kind of a transmitter or satellite of a light. Similarly, bodies can do the same. Really, in the material world can be the same way. It can be dull and sort of dead, or it can be a source that can be a great mirror of light. We can see that in pictures of great saints, there is an effulgence surrounding them, and the body takes on a luminous sort of appearance, and that's very moon-like. So similarly, great devotees, great saints in India are sometimes compared to the moon. So this is the duality of the moon, is that the moon is representative of the dullness and deadness of matter in the material world and all that's temporary and fleeting here, that we can potentially get lost in ignorance and darkness of our consciousness, the ignorance of the mode of material nature in yoga philosophy called tamas, or ignorance. It's a mode that brings us into inertia and lostness or confusion or even madness and sleep. So the moon is similarly related to madness and sleep and indolence and laziness and lostness and irrationality, madness, lunacy, right? But on the other hand, it's also related to the remembrance of something divine. It's related to memory itself, in fact, and it's also related to the idea of capturing something essential and shining or being filled with it. So, for example, there's a statement in the ancient Greek astrologers that said that if the moon was almost full, it was not yet full, but was almost full, that you might be that if you were born with this, I happened to be born with this. I was born as the full moon lunar eclipse was applying. The full moon is said to, if it's applying but not yet full, the person will either go mad or become possessed by a god or the muse. Now, this is the idea that the moon, which is connected to the mind in Indian astrology, as well, is the moon, the mind, the body, the temperament, the vessel will become animate and fully lit up. And that means either that you'll become like the inspired emissary of a god, like a devotee of a god, or the preacher or minister of some higher being or intelligence, or you, like, for example, the idea of a sort of Dionysian idea of being sort of filled with something and intoxicated and filled with the light of some transcendental state of consciousness or something. But on the other hand, the muse, an artistic spirit of some kind that can come through and you can be captured by. Because remember, this is something, the moon is a container. It's a great dish that collects things that are not its own, but then shines with them. Now, this receptive element of the moon means that the moon is also the medium, the messenger, and is also a disseminator, whether that's artistic or in service to some higher spirit or god or energy. That's what the moon can do, or it can go mad. It can become possessed, in a sense, by collections of fragmental energies that drive us somewhere off the cliff, so to speak. So the moon was associated with that traditionally as well. So there's a variety of things that the moon can contain and reflect, and some of them are healthy and some of them are not so healthy. And remember again that as Cancer is coming down from the summit of the sky, the journey down from the summer solstice, Cancer is also a sign that has to do with a kind of nostalgic departures, departure from the source, from heaven, from spirit, from the divine or eternal realm. And this descent is one that is filled with longing and remembrance of where it came from. So in some ways, we think of Cancer as, oh, it likes home. Cancer is like home and the crab, and and we kind of think about the crab and the crab's love of privacy and little holes in the ground and stuff like that, and crabs come out under the moon, and there's funny little stereotypes like that. But where do they come from, right? Where does the desire for home come from? Is it just because moon equals mom, and so I want my mom, and that's no? We have to be a little bit more intelligent about this. The moon is related to mother, specifically because the moon as mother serves as the place, the holder, the womb, the container in which spirit or the seed is cultivated, held, and something gestates within it and then is born. And then as a child comes into the world, obviously it remains connected it remains connected to its source. And so the mother is this great lunar symbol because the moon gestates the light within it. It carries it, it grows big and full, just like a pregnant woman becomes big and full with a child. And then as the light wanes, in a sense, you have the releasing, and that's menstrual cycle. That's, so all of these things with the moon are very tied into life and mothers and mothering, not just because the moon is related to water, and water are emotions, and so women are emotional and children need their mothers, and it's sort of these very loose connections that get just little fragments of what Cancer and the moon are really about. The mother serves as a place for the child to remember the source that it comes from, which is essentially invisible and often remains. We remain for most of our lives feeling as though we're looking or searching for something intangible, and sometimes we confuse the emotions that come along with the desire to be connected to something intangible. We confuse the emotional desire for that with the moon being emotional. But the moon is related to emotions insofar as emotions themselves are the reflections of a desire or a longing that is itself more intangible, that lives again in a space of consciousness that for most of us, unless we have a spiritual practice in our lives, is very hard to realize or have any sense of tangible connection to. This is also why the moon is related to the way that emotional desires for that intangible source can drive us to try to feed our longing in all different kinds of ways that are really rooted in illusion. For example, I don't feel good, so I'll emotionally eat, or I'll emotionally spend, or I'll, the emotions are a symptom of a longing for something intangible. And the moon itself contains that within it, because the moon is a reflective light behind which is a kind of deadness, a kind of blankness, and actually a kind of heaviness. So the very important thing to remember here is that the moon is something that has the potential to keep us in remembrance to our loving source, whether that's conceptualized as the Divine Mother or the Divine Father, or, however you want to think about it. The moon has to do with the longing that we feel to connect and stay connected to stay lit up with, and reflective of the source. Like we want our lives, in a sense, to become a clear, transparent medium through which the light of consciousness comes through, because that is our source. That's who we actually are. It's where we come from and where we continue on to after we've passed out of these bodies. So, and this is the philosophy of ancient Platonism and Neoplatonism and Indian philosophy and so forth. So there's a great example of this, which comes from, again, I like to call in the Narnia Chronicles. If you've ever seen, or if you ever read the book, I should say, I think they made a movie of it, I don't know. But the film version is, the book is called The Silver Chair. And The Silver Chair was written by C.S. Lewis specifically with the lunar archetype in mind. And we have to ask ourselves, if you've never read Planet Narnia, which is this very beautiful exploration of the way in which C.S. Lewis embedded each of the 7 Narnia Chronicles with a planetary archetype per novel. And he did so as a way of trying to illuminate sort of 7 different planetary aspects of Christ consciousness, which is very, very interesting in its own. And give credit for C.S. Lewis being a lot more esoteric and I think eclectic than a lot of people maybe thought he was. I get a kick out of that because I grew up, in the sort of evangelical Midwest where a lot of people in my communities would have believed that the Narnia Chronicles were like proper Christian education, and like that, this is screw the pagans or whatever. Like little did some of these people know that the Narnia Chronicles were actually infused with this planetary alchemy. So I love that, and I sense that my own my mother and father read me the books and stuff like that, and I sense that my parents, probably thinking how eclectic my own parents are, I sense that they probably enjoyed the books for the same reason. So at any rate, The Silver Chair is a book in the Narnia Chronicles that starts off like this. The heroine Jill starts off her adventure into Narnia. They're all the children's books. They go into Narnia for a kind of adventure, and usually some very deep lessons that accompany them. Well, in this lunar-themed book, Jill is the heroine of the book, and that's unique because it's a lunar-themed book. And so there are 2 books where the protagonist is really a female lead, and that's now I'm going to forget. Magician's Nephew and Silver Chair. Those are the 2, and it's Venus and the Moon's books. Okay, at any rate, so in Silver Chair, Jill starts off in Narnia, and she starts off in Aslan's country. She's with Aslan, who's sort of the Christ figure in Aslan's country, and Aslan is giving her instructions for this adventure that she's going to go on in Narnia. But before she can go down into Narnia, these instructions have to be given. And he says, look, here's the instructions. And when you get down there in Narnia, the air will become very dense. And in that denseness, you will start to forget my instructions to you. And so you're going to have to really struggle hard to remember these instructions. He says to keep repeating them. This is basically a metaphor for saying the translunary world of the ancient alchemists and astrologers was a place that was more heavenly. And once you came down into the earthly realm, you were in the sublunary sphere, and everything became denser. And you were prone to sleep and prone to forgetfulness. And so the instructions that he says to repeat them to yourself is not much different from what we see yogis telling us, or the great Rinpoches telling us, or the lamas telling us, repeat your mantra. Why? Because in this world we tend to forget the dwelling of the soul in the heavenly realms, which is a co-present reality of the soul. The soul exists in many spheres at once. And we, in this realm, sometimes we get glimpses of it in spiritual or religious experiences. And all of the experiences are the same. Like, I can't forget this. I have to remember this, right? So Aslan says, once you get down there, the air will be denser and you'll tend to forget. You're going to tend to forget things. So accordingly, Jill goes down into Narnia, and she notices it right away, that the air is like thicker and a little denser. And in the meantime, what's happened is Rillian, who's like a prince, he's missing, and he's, if I remember correctly, I'm going to maybe forget a little piece of this, but Rillian's gone missing, searching for his mother, who was, or searching to kill a witch who had killed his mother. And so he goes after this witch in kind of the spirit of revenge, to take revenge. And he's never seen again. And so they're going down there to help find this missing prince. Anyway, there's this long journey that unfolds, and it's very interesting. But essentially, they have to go underground. They have to go deep underground, where they can no longer see the light of the sun. And it's this deep kind of catacomb-like place beneath the earth. And once they're down there in that place, essentially all along the way, Jill keeps forgetting the instructions. And because she keeps forgetting the instructions, they keep getting into all these misadventures. And then they're barely saved because she'll remember the instruction, like sort of just at the right moment, and then they keep going. Well, she's really starting to forget the instructions when they get underground. They find Prince Rilian underground, and he's completely mad. He's become enchanted by a spell. And in the underground world, the only time that he comes back to his senses and remembers what's going on is at nighttime, basically when the moon comes out, and he's tied at that time. He's tied to a silver chair, and the silver chair binds him, and he can't get out of it. And the only moment that he actually remembers that he's the prince and not this other person that he's been enchanted to believe that he is. So it's this very interesting thing, because in the way that he got bound to the chair is while he's under the enchantment, this witch convinces him, look, every night you go mad and you could be a danger to yourself or others, so we should really tie you up. And he's like, oh, yes, we should tie me up, right? So then he gets tied up, only to remember once he's tied up, like, oh, wait, I'm really the prince and that witch has me under a spell. But then by morning, he's asleep again. So what happens is the kids have to convince him, they have to try to convince him that he's actually the prince, but he can't because he's under the spell. Meanwhile, they keep forgetting who they are, and they keep forgetting the instructions of Aslan. So it's this really kind of beautiful lunar symbolism of the possibility of forgetting our eternal source or remembering. And then basically what happens from that point forward, I won't give away the whole book, but basically through repetition of the name of Aslan, which is common in all traditions. In the Bhakti tradition I practice, for example, recitation, chanting of the names of Krishna, the names of God. This is a part of how one keeps the fire going internally, keeps the consciousness alive and awake. So similarly, they have to say the name of Aslan, and it has to break him out of his slumber, so to speak. So that's part of how the adventure goes on. And this is the lunar realm in general. It has to do with remembrance of where we come from, devotional remembrance and keeping things alive. Just like a mother keeps a small child feeling safe, feeling held, feeling close to the womb, feeling close to the source. That comforting, that protecting, and that keeping of something is the sacredness of the moon. The moon is always a reminder in the sky. The moon is always a sort of silver invitation to remember our noble character. The ennobledness of the soul is in fact connected to the color of silver in alchemy. So there's something very rich about the lunar symbolism that goes far beyond it goes far beyond all of the the just stuff about moms and cooking, and do you know what I mean? And so it's pretty deep. Now the poet is a great example of a lunar character. The poet, the romantic, nostalgia, the photo books, and also the keeping of things. We talk a lot about Cancer, hoarding or keeping things. So this is a lunar thing, because when we keep things around us in fragments and bits and parts, it's a way of trying to actually keep something that's more intangible close to us, to keep close to something. And because we see more than meets the eye in trinkets and things in life, and so we keep them and put them around us. A lot of people have really elaborate altars in their homes that are filled with a lot of things that most people would look at and go like, what is that? Why do you have that on your altar? And one of the main reasons is because we say it's special to me. Well, that means that it's something other than a knickknack. It's not just what it appears to be. It's shining with something more. It's reflective of something more. That's why we collect things. That's why we try to keep things. Now, of course, the dark side of the moon is the side that believes that it's literally the keeping of these things. So if I lost all of these things, then all of that feeling would be gone. While it is sometimes hard and difficult to let go of keepsakes or things that we're fond of, what to speak of you know, we were talking last day about Saturn. Saturn, the darkening, the dissolution, the blackening, the letting go, the disintegration. Saturn's like, don't be sentimental. Your family's going to die someday. They'll get a new family in another lifetime. You've had lots of husbands or wives before. You'll have more. Like, don't. This is temporary. Saturn's very like just, it's the dissolution of things and the surrendering to the of just the infinitude of it all, and just saying like, just put this stuff in perspective for a second. Saturn feels really cold to people a lot of the times because of that. But don't forget that it's the same kind of vastness that the poet has with Saturn as it does with the moon. They're just oriented a little bit differently. The moon is interested in the connection to things, the way that things connect. Moon is often related to the spider and web weavers, and the moon is itself described oftentimes throughout the history of astrology as the weaver of the planetary stories, because it collects the lights of all of the planets and then disseminates them. In fact, there's no better way really when doing predictive astrology than to look at the moon day by day. For example, one of the things I made a recent series on lunar tracking. One of the things that I said in the lunar tracking video was, if you practice lunar tracking day in and day out for a long time, your world will start to shimmer with a kind of otherworldliness. You start to feel the presence of the eternal in your midst, because you can see, oh, the moon was doing this, oh, the moon was doing that. Let me give you an example. This morning I woke up, right? I woke up and moon was squaring Pluto this morning, right? Moon in Aries squared to Pluto in Capricorn. And I drew an I Ching for the morning, and the I Ching symbol was about someone attacking you. And I thought, oh God, moon's applying to a square to Pluto, someone attacking me. That doesn't sound like fun. So I send out my daily Kickstarter email, and I updated however many backers I have left or whatever, and kind of rally the troops to get some more backers for the day. And I got an email back, and it was just one sentence, right? And it felt so dark and nasty, and it just said, "I predict that you will not meet your goal." And that was it. And like, if I didn't know astrology, right, I would have been like, oh my gosh, what a rude, horrible thing to say. Maybe it still is. But I was like, oh wow, moon Pluto. All right. I was like, just someone just got possessed by moon Pluto. Like I can't take it nearly as personally as I used to. I can't help but just marvel. I'm like, that's freaking cool. So someone just issued a kind of dark prognostication I didn't ask for, but totally turning in my swimming pool for the day, right? But at least I can see that it's moon Pluto going on right now. So this is just a funny example, right, of someone being like, let me throw some Plutonian shade at you. You know what I mean? And the moon just reflects what's going on. Moon in the Mars-ruled sign, it's aggressive, it's dark, it's heavy, kind of dark, foreboding prognostication. Just, I predict you will not meet your goal. End. Thank you. Glad you like my stuff, I guess. I don't know. So, okay, so if you do this day in and day out and track the moon, right, but what happens is, like, I can't look at that event with normal eyes. Like, that event suddenly to me is deep and interesting and magical. And I'm like, I'm in awe of that. Like, okay, that's what came into my life right now. What can I do but accept it? What can I do but look and say, oh, what a shiny, interesting object. I think I'll put it on my altar of experiences and love it. Because what else can I do? I see it shimmering with gods. You know what I mean? So that's the kind of, that's the moon is giving us that sense of connection, right? On the other hand, if you go flip over to Saturn, and so the moon in that regard is like a poet. It's teaching us to have a kind of poetic relationship to everything that's happening in our lives. Not to take it personally, but just to see the world shimmering. It's been dead up until this cool moon Pluto event. You know what I'm saying? So I was like, all right, it's now alive. That's the moon, the web weaver, the storyteller, the prognosticator, the movement of things, and connective tissue. Saturn, on the other hand, is the poetic vastness, right? Saturn is like saying, Saturn is like saying, well, like, for example, I went to a funeral on Saturday. Robert Schmidt, famous astrologer, just passed away. And I had been getting to know him a little bit over the past couple of years. And so I went to his funeral, and I was driving home through the mountains in the rain, and it was so saturnine, so vast. It was like, his wife at the funeral said, it wasn't supposed to happen like this. We thought we were going to have a lot more time left to finish research, and on the way home, I was just contemplating I was just like, yeah, it doesn't matter. Like, you could think your life is going any which way you want, and then suddenly just something really hard and difficult happens, and you just are gone, right? Your life just ends. And it happens all the time. It happens every day. All we have to do is turn on the news. It's not really new at all. That's the perspective of Saturn, but it's equally poetic. We don't like it, especially with our sort of Pollyanna New Age face. We're like, no, like it's all, we have to immediately go back to how it's all a part of my purpose, right? Saturn is just like, just sit with it and feel the rain, feel the heaviness, feel the darkness, let it take you inward. That's poetic as well. So when we pit these things against one another, we're not really getting ourselves anywhere. That's why I said last week, the soul stands in the middle. The soul is the great mediator. The soul partakes of the nature of God in the sense that it can reconcile all opposites within itself. In consciousness, that's what we're capable of. That's what I believe our real purpose is. And you could go Cancer, you could go Capricorn. It doesn't really matter. I should know because I've got a sun and moon in Cancer and Capricorn. I feel like I'm flip-flopping between them all the time. So what I want to share with you now to kind of close our talk on the moon for the night is I want to tell you guys about an essay. Read I can't help but bring James Hillman in, right? This is from a brilliant book of his. I don't know if you can see it there. It's called Alchemical Psychology. It's a collection of essays, and if you really want to have your mind blown, check these out. In this essay, it's called Silver and the White Earth. And in Silver and the White Earth, he talks about the alchemical value of silver, which is the moon's metal, right? That's the moon's metal. Here's what he says about it, and I'm going to read a number of different sections just to kind of give you a feeling for it. He's talking about the importance of silvering in the alchemical process, which is, you could say, a metaphor for spiritual life and spiritual process. Silvering would be related to the lunar process of spiritual life, which we've already been describing through things like the silver chair and the poetic remembrance of things, and starting to see the world shimmering with eternity, starting to see the world and what we think of as really, really real as reflective of something greater, and it opens a kind of poeticness. This is silvering, and here's how James Hillman describes it. Silvering, in short, is whitening, the albedo stage of the work, and the lunification of the material refers to any process, lustration, calcination, coagulation, that can bring forth a white and gleaming condition of the soul in the material. Transmutation to silver means cleansing and purifying, which at the same time means becoming more essential and durable. These qualitative changes refer especially to the shining forth or bringing to light the moon character of the soul, including even its blues. Isn't that beautiful? Listen to what he says one more time. Transmutation to silver means cleansing and purifying, which at the same time means becoming more essential and durable. When you can have an experience like the one I was talking about earlier, and I think all of us do when we practice astrology, we have experiences like this where something happens and we're like, I don't know if I'm more impressed by what just happened to me or what just happened in my life, or if I'm more impressed by the astrology of it. Those moments are precious. Like, sit with them longer the next time they come up, because they clean us, they purify us, they polish us. Silver needs polishing to keep clean, and they bring us back to something that's more essential. They clean us like a mirror, and they make us more durable. They give us a sense of everything being connected meaningfully. Everything is brought in like a mother. That's silvering. Let's go on. This is a longer section where he talks about silver in comparison to other metals. By contrasting silver with its companion metals, we can better discern its native properties. Like copper, silver is conductive, yet it is not red. Like gold, it is weighty, noble, precious, and beautiful, but harder and less malleable. Like tin and lead, it is grayish or white and can be made useful, but unlike them, it has luster, takes a high polish, and reflects. And like mercury in its first appearance, silver is coagulated into a more steady state, not dispersible, fragmentary, and free-running. These comparisons indicate that silver is a cool white conductor. Isn't that beautiful? Silver is a cool white conductor. Sometimes we get the image of mother confused with a lot of sort of gushy qualities, really liquidy, gushy qualities. But what we're actually talking about with the moon, while the sign of Cancer is watery, and certainly there's a connotation of water and the moon, but the moon also, especially the full moon, has this feeling of being cool, lit up with something, filled with something, but also stoic and aloof in some ways. Like many virginal goddesses in ancient Greece and Rome, many goddesses remained aloof from the world. They remained virginal, not in the sense of not being sexual or being asexual, but rather in not being overly involved in things. So there's also, it's very important to remember that the moon is also related to virginality, the purity of something that's involved but also separate, that's in it but also apart from it. Something about mothers fills that role very deeply, I think. For example, there is something about a mother that makes you feel is that you can't get close enough. You can't get close enough, right? What is that can't get close enough? That's the cool white conductor of the moon. It fills, it holds, it expresses this warming, sort of brilliant, noble light, but it also has a kind of distance to it. Well, many mothering figures wrap their arms around us and take us in, but there's always some sense of being able to get closer. You can draw closer to something specifically because it remains in some ways apart. And this is part of the intimate alchemical relationship between the moon and Saturn that's also being reflected, and why also you're going to hear him in a moment talk about the fact that the moon is so intimately connected to lead as well. At any rate, the equation used so frequently in alchemy, Luna equals silver, is not a true identity. Silver corresponds with Luna only in certain respects. It is less the moon of Lilith, of the night and the dead, and certainly less the little crescent, the tiny virgin girl at the beginning, nor is silver the fluctuating moon of the tides, the blood and vegetation going through phases, turning with time, nor the moon's salty bitterness and its commonality. See, those are all moon things, but it's silver in alchemy, and the sort of spiritualizing of the moon is a little different from those things. In short, silver presents the moon's full brightness, its completion or elevation. It is the metal of a great light. To use the traditional way of speaking, an archetypal principle of immense potency equivalent to the opus major of the first great conjunction. The anima realized as an imagination so solid, a soul so bodied, that the reflections of its images whiten the earth of mundane consciousness. Wow, that is a freaking sentence. The anima realized as an imagination so solid, a soul so bodied, that the reflections of its images whiten the earth of mundane consciousness. Again and again, gold and silver are spoken of in one breath, the two perfect metals, the king and queen. The subtle difference between them shows, for instance, in these adjectives, true gold and fine silver. Gold involves us in truth, and all that truth would establish by its power an everlasting kingdom, physical or metaphysical, moral and spiritual. Silver involves us in aesthetic value, discrimination, appreciation, refinement, which is also an end in itself. So that's a really beautiful, just him talking about silver in such a beautiful way. Now, he talks about mining silver. How do we get silver? One way of mining silver, for example, in devotional or spiritual life is to circumambulate things. For example, the moon is a circumambulator around the earth and around the sun from our perspective. So the circumambulating, the circling of things, and the chanting of sacred mantras, and the circling of shrines, the mindful walking of trails and circles and loops. These are lunar activities that mine the silver and bring out they ennoble and bring a kind of silverness of mind and body, a silvering of the soul. That's why if you've ever spent time with people who spend a lot of time doing these things, you'll feel kind of elevated, like you're walking under a beautiful autumn night's moon or something like that. It just has a feeling of lifting you and deepening you at once. Let's not forget, again, the moon is intimately connected with Saturn and is the ruler of night, just as Saturn is the watcher on the liminal space at the edge of visibility. Here's some mining the silver tips from Hillman. Antiquity, that is Lucretius, Strabo, Diodorus, considered silver to result from a forest fire, a holocaust. A gigantic fire rages through a forest, charring the greenwood, decimating nature, and after that ruin, a thin stream of silver emerges. Silver, they infer, comes out of gigantic psychic disasters. It results from burnout. We claim it only after the woody bowers of protective naturalism have been totally blackened. See how it's connected to the blackening? Silver is connected to blackening alchemically, and that is the relationship between the moon and Saturn. When deep, heavy, difficult, scorching, exhausting, difficult things happen, out of it comes an ennobling. If we choose to be reflective, choose to be with the experience, a deep stream of silver, like a tributary of silver emerges inside of us. It's where we get the beautiful grayness of our hairs. Here we go to the protection of lead and the release of silver from lead as a white dove indicates the precious and noble nature attributed to silver. A whiteness with the wings of a dove can emerge from a leaden state that seems completely to enclose it. The dull and heavy heart of lead conceals a dove of silver. To extract it, we need dry heat and vinegar. Silver does not come forth easily, and a ton of smelted lead usually contains only a few ounces of silver. Right? Beautiful. The release of the dove does not separate it from its weightiness, that gravitas of the spirit. It carries lead into its silver. Imagine the lead becoming winged, mobile, airborne, hovering over the operations with serious attentiveness, as a dove with outspread wings stays suspended over a scene in medieval icons. The spirit no longer caught in immanence only, immersed in laborious struggles with the dull and dense. Lead as the metal of Saturn, cold, heavy, dense, was not used widely before Roman times. Like silver, it was not technically as practical as were iron and copper, so that both lead and silver, Saturn and the moon, like Saturn and the moon, were more otherworldly, religious, and mystical than the more worldly planets and metals of Mars, iron, Venus, copper, and Jupiter, tin. Typical of the Roman approach were the practical uses found for lead and silver, plumbing and utensils for daily life. Silver decoration, for instance, was the boast of high society. So there you have it, right? That from the lead, from the darkness, from the density comes the shimmering. The same thing of the moon. It's a dark rock in a sense, you know? It's heavy, but it also it becomes this perfect reflective mirroring surface where the silver blue light of the moon shines. Depression is the price of silver. Melancholy has, ever since Aristotle's Problemata, been the disease of thinkers. This is why the moon is also related to the mind. The more white reflection, the more burdened lead. As we produce silver, we increase the lead. This is surely familiar. An insight may be shining in itself, but it makes no dent on the gray mood from which it came. We have the feeling of lead poisoning, a state of being swallowed by the lead, lost in the lead mine. It's all so slow and long. What use we feel, these silver mirrorings, this trickle of light, if the caughtness of depression does not lift. The truth, however, is that the depression is the mine. This is the lead necessary for the silver, even if the silver is neither useful nor functional in altering the lead itself. We mine silver from lead, but do not do away with the lead, for that would close down the mine. This is, again, the relationship between Saturn in Capricorn and the moon in Cancer. Here we must remember the curious metallurgic fact that silver corrupts in air. It tarnishes. It converts with the chlorides in rainwater so that it is naturally found mainly together in argentiferous lead ores. Only very rarely can silver be found unalloyed under the earth in mountainous regions. Silver blackens in air and cannot always gleam as gold. Silver requires polishing, attention, a bit of rubbing and fussing. It calls for worry. I would add that it also calls for privacy. One of the reasons that some of the most sacred and ennobling qualities that we see in people that we admire, whether it's a teacher or a poet or an artist or a friend or someone that we consider to be sensible and sensitive, intelligent, but also careful. I think that these people have a way of making you feel a hidden depth where they're polishing something. I polish something when nobody's looking. I believe we should all be doing that because I feel that so much of our worth is rooted in how well we polish the silver of our soul, not in how much we aspire for the golden emblem of purpose and specialness and all of that kind of stuff. That's why I rail a little bit on the North Node, to be honest, in terms of the way that it's read as all of that. But that's me. I'm a little advocate of, I'm a Cancer, Capricorn, Sun, Moon. So of course I like this dynamic a lot. Since exposure makes it lose its shine, it is best hidden, protected. It is covered with blackness by silence and dullness, and by hiding itself invisibly in lead. Some of the most beautiful, beautiful things, in other words, that we find in life happen in the common and the ordinary, not when we react to it and try to shift or turn it into the accomplishment of our ultimate purpose, but rather when we keep it and protect we found some shimmering pocket of something, and it's private and it's special and it's secretive and it's hidden, and we polish it and keep it. It has to stay close to the lead for it to remain precious to us. It has to stay close to the darkness in which we found it. And a lot of the ways that darkness shine forth are in, really, to be, excuse my French, but to be completely honest, it's in the shit heap of life, right? That we discover those beautiful streams of silver. So manifest silver has the brilliant and precious qualities of gold. And when we try to imagine the nature of silver using solar consciousness, silver becomes at once occulted, which then depresses silver into an amalgam with lead, right? So there's also this thing where if you try to be too precious and too overt with things that you think of as oh so touching and oh so beautiful, and if it becomes too sentimental, essentially you are solarizing it. It's like mansplaining, right? It's like someone is like I had an experience and it was like it was so precious, and it was people when they sentimentalize the moon, right? In a sense, it's a masculinizing of the more feminine qualities of the moon, or it's a way of not. Silver needs the dark to really shine forth with its blue white light. So we have to be very careful that we don't try to make lunar things overly solar. By one of the things that I can't stand, honestly, being in the yoga studio industry for a long time now, right? And I'm just going to pick low-hanging fruit. I don't mean to be a jerk, but like there's a lot of like real preciousness, like let's eye gaze and put our hands over each other's hearts and like, really just smile at everyone, and like, just kind of this over the top sentimental thing. And sometimes people will call it feminine. And in some cases, there's just a lot of love and a lot of sweetness and tenderness going around, and I have no problem with that, right? And or even it being said that that's a nurturing or mothering energy that maybe we need more of. But on the other hand, sometimes it just crosses a line, where it's just like that's actually a really overbearing and actually very aggressive and assertive thing that's happening. And the moon calls for privacy. Its brilliance is more, it's kept in a more gentle way. And sometimes on the outside, it appears almost like leaden. It appears almost a little more stoic. For example, if you've ever heard the Dalai Lama suddenly burst forward into great laughter, that's the hidden silver of the moon. He's a Cancer. If you've ever seen Thich Nhat Hanh burst into laughter, often these saintly people, for example, on the outside, they carry the Zen countenance. They carry a countenance that's very stoic and, in a sense, very calm and cool, right? But then suddenly something can come spilling out that's so beautiful and so, it just shines forth, and it's so surprising. So I think one of my favorite poets is Mary Oliver. And one of the reasons that I love Mary Oliver so very much is because Mary Oliver has this way of taking you into private and very ordinary things and showing you the kind of silvery luster that they have. Okay. He says, now he's talking about fantasy. Fantasies, in other words, whatever their nature, contain silver. This silvered brain presents itself in descriptions of silver fantasy forms. For instance, the reign of the moon lasts just 3 weeks, but because it's close, the substance exhibits a great variety of forms. It will become liquid and again coagulate 100 times a day. Sometimes it will present the appearance of fish's eyes, and then again of tiny silver trees with twigs and leaves. Whenever you look at it, you will have cause for astonishment, particularly when you see it all divided into beautiful but very minute grains of silver. This is the white tincture, right? It's talking about the moon. It's talking about fantasy and images, and it's talking about, a rich life is one where you don't just have experiences and then try to interpret them in terms of your agenda, but rather you allow them to, you start circumambulating your own experiences and letting images shine forth from within them, and all of these different things. And now he's comparing that to the shape of silver. If you've ever seen a chunk of silver, these shapes and patterns, these variegated filigrees, are ways to find silver in the bits and grains and swimming sparkles of reflection, dream fragments and tinsely fantasies, twigs of branching thoughts 100 times a day, the interlaced connections marked by the interior uhs or our awareness resonating in our throats as the whitening mind emerges in its night. Oh, I just get the chills when I read that. It's just so pretty. Silver comes in the shape of fantasy. It can be mined from our brain's projected, imagined figurations. Silver as the metal of imaging indicates that imaging itself may be the mode of mining silver and whitening our brains. Wow. He goes on and talks at length about silver and money and the economy, which is very interesting. I won't read that, but just to give you a preview and really recommend that you check this essay out. He also then talks about this in death, the moon and death, very important. According to Plutarch's essay on the face and the orb of the moon, our composite personality, body, soul, spirit, goes through at least 2 deaths or separations. The first, which Plutarch calls the death of Demeter, occurs on earth and separates soul and spirit from body, swiftly and violently, natural death. The second death takes place on the moon. And by the way, this is common in so many different cultures, by the way, that death and the soul going to the moon come next. That's like really old and like all over the planet. At any rate, this death belongs to Persephone. It separates mind, nous, from soul, gently and by slow degrees, resulting in mindless souls and soulless minds. These souls on the moon become, as it were, free-floating fantasies, disembodied and mindless both, holy images or idola. They are driven by the affective element gone astray in delusion. However, these alienated moony souls can be ordered by the moon, says Plutarch, if they stay there in that place and condition, for in time they shall receive new light and can return to earthly affairs and human body in a sane condition. The moon is also the main planet that's related to reincarnation. That's why we have the nodes of the moon involved in a conversation about reincarnation, and why eclipses are also about reincarnation. But remember, again, from the standpoint of most ancient Eastern traditions, the recycling of lives and stories that you've lived previously do not come to bear very much at all on the importance of what you're supposed to be doing spiritually with the spiritual practice, which is about the relationship that you build with any story. Doesn't matter. It's not necessarily the story. From the standpoint of eternity, all stories are sort of, they all get sort of equal attention. They're all sort of equally interesting from the standpoint of eternity. It's how you live those stories that's also very important. Now, that's not to take away from the importance of the protagonist, the narrative, the hero, the journey, the sense of purpose that's so strong. Like, that's there too. But can we just have a moment for the moon? Can we just have a moment for Saturn? Can we have a moment for the relationship between the two that's not blotted out by the pure, brilliant antsiness of solar consciousness? You know what I mean? Sometimes that's how it is. In Shakespeare's play about two moonstruck and lunatic lovers, Romeo says in the balcony scene of Act 2, "How silver sweet sound lovers' tongues by night." This is a spiritual statement, not just it's a statement about how we can get lost in everything. And it's also a perfect description of how we are all really meant to fall in love with all stories. And that's if there's anything that's the greatest luxury that we're provided in modern life, is in a sense the ability to go out and serve others, so that others who are not as fortunate may also find the great nurturance and the great silvering of their life, whatever their life might be, whatever scenarios of fate they may be within. The real liberation is already here in all moments, and it's to be mined from within the raw material of every story. That's the ore and the lead of Saturn, and that's the silvering of the moon. I'll read one more little piece, and then we're going to be done. The silvering by which we hear the soundness in words implies that they are worlds themselves, and do not need to gain authentication through reference. Words sound their own depths of reflection, allusions, alliterations, etymologies, puns, the guises of rhetoric. These resonances in words are the singing of angels hitherto throttled by the golden rules of logic, objective reference, and definition. We are in the realm of voices, lunacy, the mind sounding itself, sounding its depths, hearing its essential nature as a choir of voices, discordant, antiphonic, responsive, the dead soul in us speaking, ghosts swaying on the family tree, the unborn clustered on the moon, all sounding, talking with our voices and listening to them, hallucinatory. He really wants to give life to what so often we want to cast aside and keep in disembodied form. All that's cast out in life, all that we like to think, well, that's without purpose, or that really wasn't a part of my purpose, or I got to find my purpose and get away from whatever it is that's not my purpose. Hillman wants all that we think of as not our purpose. He wants us to recognize something shining there, something that's even more precious, specifically because we tend to neglect it, specifically because we tend to not look for the shining things in the dark places. So I really appreciate that about Hillman. I hope that you guys have appreciated me kind of really trying to mine some metal tonight. So thank you very much, everybody, for listening. I hope that this gives you some sense of what's to come with the lunar qualities and the Saturnine qualities in the next year and a half will really be coming forth. The eclipses in the moon sign will take us into the spring of 2020. We'll be having eclipses in these two signs for quite a while now to come. The first one is happening on January 5th. I'll be writing about that a bit in January's horoscopes. If you appreciate this talk, a lot of research goes into every one of my talks. A lot of thought and consideration goes into all the things that I write and do. For the last 40 days of every year, I also fundraise to support my career doing this. This is the bulk of my work. And so my fundraiser each year, it becomes something like my salary. And after taxes are taken out and, just everything is done, it's a modest salary. And so I appreciate every year people who really enjoy my work pitching in if they can. I try to always offer things so that there's something, a gift in it for my readers or my viewers. I'm going to put the link in the chat box right now. It's You can donate anything you can, $5, $10, $25. You can pick a reading. I do a year ahead tarot, astrology, or I Ching reading for you, record it and send it to you, tell you maybe a little bit about your year ahead. So also discounted tuitions to my courses. Again, I appreciate all of you so much, and it's been a real joy to talk about this, because this is my home sun and moon sign, and I was born under an eclipse that was happening just not long at all after I was born in Capricorn. And so this is going to be a big year and a half for me. I've also got Pluto opposing my sun coming up, so should be a fun one. Take care, everyone. I hope you have a beautiful rest of your week, and look forward to connecting with you all again soon.